Today, we are discussing piecing the census puzzle together. And so, for this program, we are basically going to be going over the basics about the census records, and then we are going to look through a few stories and see what that census was able to help us learn about several families. So, just to kind of go over some basic facts that people should know about the census, the first thing you should know is that the census was done every 10 years, starting in 1790. With the census, it is held for 72 years. So, what that means for us as researchers seeking our families is that we have to wait until next year, 2022, before we get to see the 1950 census. So the most current census that's available for us to research today is 1940, and then we can go and look every 10 years going back to 1790. But there is a brief exception in there. That exception is the 1890 census. Unfortunately, this census, a good portion of it, majority of it, burned. And so there is just remnant pieces that do remain, and those are openly available for researchers to access what is available. But most of us, unfortunately, are not able to access because it burned. So otherwise, every 10 years, we can trace our family, which is very, very vital to us as researchers and very beneficial to us. And the thing with the census is every 10 years, they're asking all these questions. And we just went through a census recently in 2020. But the questions that are asked every year differ in some way. They may sound the same, but sometimes the wording was tweaked, which led to different results. And so knowing those details is very, very beneficial to us and can make a difference in learning something about our families that we're looking for. With those details, you do need to pay attention to those questions being asked every single year. Don't just assume. One of the things about looking at a census record is, well, who all is listed on that record and what is available to us. So for 1790 to 1840, the census typically looks like this page here, where it is a listing of an individual and a lot of statistical marks, which these individuals who are listed here are the head of household only. Now, this becomes a dilemma for those who have ancestors who are multi-generational households living together. This does not mean do not look at these, but just keep that in mind that sometimes you have to know who that head of household was, and it may not be the ancestor you're seeking. It could be a father, father-in-law, and so forth. The 1850 through the 1940 census looks a bit different, as you can see. There's a lot more questions asked. It's not primarily statistics at this point. The government changed those questions every time they did a census because they were seeking key pieces of information. And so for beginning in 1850, they started having every free individual living in the household listed on the census. I stress that word free because African Americans who were enslaved would not be listed on the regular census because it was for every free individual. So, some things for us to consider as we start our search through the census. There are things we need to know before we can truly dive in, and there's some important things we need to just make sure we are aware of. One of the key things is a person's name. It's always interesting the way we think of names, but many of us typically have our given name, our first name, our middle name, and for females, our maiden name, and then our married name or surname. The thing is with those names, When the census taker was asking the questions, one of the key questions that rarely was asked was, how do you spell that? And so the census taker is documenting the name as he's hearing it. And so because of this, sometimes we have some variant spellings on names. And so we need to think of these variant spellings. And not necessarily because, oh, it's they changed my name. It's not necessarily that. It's no one changed the name. It's just a fact of the time that the fact that they just went ahead and wrote down the names they were hearing. Another thing with names is, well, people who intermix their first name and their middle name. Many people would go by their middle names because of the naming patterns in the family, and you would have multitude of individuals with the same given name over multiple generations. And so some individuals would use their middle names instead. And so doing variant searches is very critical. But then we also have to think of all those nicknames. You got to think of all the variant nicknames that could possibly come up. For Margaret, you got to think about Mary, Marge, Peg, Peggy. I have an example in my family where to differentiate the two Ezras. The younger one actually had an injury and he was called Lame Ezra. Don't be surprised, he's indexed with the first name Lame on numerous documents. So we have to think of all these names, first name, middle name, maiden name, variant surnames, and nicknames. Dates are critical to us now, but even a few generations ago, our ancestors weren't as interested in dates as we were. And so when asked for things like your age, they kind of fumbled. And sometimes when they were asked, how long have you been married, or other questions pertaining to time, they sometimes were a little off on those dates. And so we need to be aware of that. And we should also know about those locations and the fact that, well, boundaries changed a lot. And so we definitely need to be using maps to make sure we know what the boundaries were at the time of these records. Knowing various family members can be a key component in helping us be able to determine if we are on the right family when we're looking at families with the same names. Those other family members can be the key and the thing that makes our puzzle piece fit together. Including the family members' names, other details. There's so many details in these census records that can benefit us, such as occupation, industry the person worked in, as well as birthplaces. And I know people aren't going to like hearing this, but you still to this day should probably browse the census. You never know who your neighbors were for your ancestors, and you never know that they could possibly be other family. There are many errors involved with the census from the moment the person started to ask their question, who they were asking the question of, how well that person knew the answers, to the person writing it down. How great was their handwriting? When the person had to transcribe it later, how well could they read that writing? Did they skip lines? So many errors could happen. And these lead to a lot of original oops, is what we'll call them, where on these records, as we start to look at them, we find a number of these errors, and we have to be aware of that. So if we are looking for the exact spelling for our family and we are looking for the exact date, exact location, we are not going to find them. So we need to really think outside the box with census records. So I want to show you an example of some index records. So many of us, we just jump on the computer, go to our favorite site, and we start to search for our family that we're seeking. And the thing is, well, it just depends. There can be issues with those indexes, so we should definitely take a look at as many indexes as we can. Look at this example of 1920 is the one at the top and 1930 is the one at the bottom for the exact same family in Wilkes County, North Carolina. And yet, one of these is actually indexed as green and the other is indexed as queen. So You can see why the person who indexed this would make that mistake. But not only is there the fact of the surname, there's also, well, look at the names of the individuals. Here we have Genia, spelled possibly two different ways here, but looking at those ages and the family grouping, we start to figure out this is the same family. Here we have Royal as a son in 1920, Roblo as a son in 1930. 1920, he's 6 years old. 1930, he's 15. Bella is listed as a son who's 2 years old. We have Bello, a son who's 13. And Mary, who's a daughter who's 1 month. And Ella, who is a daughter who's 11. This starts to tell us that this is the right family unit. But boy, look at even just the names that were given to the census taker. And then, of course, there's that indexing issue with the last name, where one indexer viewed it as Green and another as Queen. Here's another example. Here we have the last name of Bostic, in which one particular company listed that as an index record for Basty. You can see why the person thought that's what was written here. And then when we look at another index for this exact same page, but from a different website, they have the spelling of Bostic. So when you are searching, and I'm just using Ancestry as an example here, you're always going to want to see how the website you're looking at can do the variant searching for you. So you could match all terms exactly, but you can then select if you want to select a first name that sounds like or is similar, or even initials, because those ancestors who love to use initials. Last name, once again, that sounds like and similar in the soundex of a name. Smith and Schmidt, just one example. Birth, always try to do plus or minus 2 years. Sometimes you have to expand out to 5 years. It depends. But definitely play with this. Don't do an exact science, because that is what Ancestry does. It takes the age and it takes the year, and it just does basic math. But here in 2020, boy, I just messed up my dates. 2021, here in 2021, you aren't the same age throughout 2021 unless you were born on January 1st. And choosing your location that you are searching in. Try to go as broad as possible for census records, going into the county or even the state, or if it's a state that might have been a part of another state, you might want to try to do variants where you're doing states and adjacent states as an option. One great example here in Allen County, for example, is the town of Huntertown, which is in the northern area of Allen County. If you search for Huntertown in the census, it's not going to come up because it was Eel River Township. And that's why you should try to broaden your searches when looking for locations, because location names did change. So that was a quick overview of sort of the generalities and the history of the census to kind of give you some background. Now we are actually going to dive into those census records, and we are going to do this by looking at some particular family stories and seeing what the census tells us about these families. So this one, the first one we're going to look at, is called A Story About a Name. In this one, we are going to start looking at those pre-1850 census records. We have 1840, Providence County, Rhode Island. Many people look at these and just decide that they aren't informative, which is very disappointing. 1840 has one of my personal favorite questions. So here we have this example where the second family down is Oliver Wade, and there's a male 60, 70 years old, so we assume that's Oliver's, the head of household. There is a male who's 15 to 20 based on the numbers that are given on the census, a female 60 to 70 years old, and another female who's 90 to 100 years old living on this with Oliver Wade. 1840 census, though, had 2 pages to it. On the back page are more questions. So when you find Oliver, for example, on the 1840 census, you have to click the next page button to see the next image, which shows you the backside of the census. On this backside, there is a famous question here where the census taker would ask if anyone in that household was receiving a pension, then his or her age, and this person could be the survivor of the war or their spouse who received the pension for Revolutionary War service. So here we have the 90 to 100-year-old woman. Her name is Molly Wade. Going back in time 10 more years, we have 1830 Providence County, Rhode Island once again. Looking for the Wade family, I have an Isaac Wade, and his household is broken down, as you can see. And right below him is Oliver Wade, same Oliver from 1840, in which we get a breakdown of his family. And right below him is Molly Wade, and she's 80 to 90 years old. So, would this be where I'd stop? Absolutely not. I'm going to jump another 20 years back into 1810 in this county. Here we have, once again, that Isaac Wade from the previous one with his household. Lots of young children here, as well as Isaac, and who we assume is his wife, who's of similar age. And then we also have a gentleman named Nathaniel Wade. In 1810, the question for the age did not break down above the age of 45. It was just 45 and greater. But we have Nathaniel Wade listed here as a male, 45 plus, with a female, 45 plus. Based on location, based on particular details, tracking the census, I'm going to feel safe to believe, to search more to discover if Nathaniel's wife is Molly, the Molly we've been tracking. Sure enough, I don't have the example here in this program today, but Nathaniel Wade is a Revolutionary War soldier who did die before the 1840 census, and his wife received a widow's pension, and her name is Molly Wade. And so I would know to look for those records because of what was found here on these pre-1850 census. So here you have just an example of why you should look at those pre-1850 census records. So I hope the story of a name has really made you want to go after this program and take a look for your own family. Next up, we are going to look at a motivational tale. One of the great things about our ancestors is there's reasons for why they do what they do. It's not always clear to us why they did what they did, but they had their own motivations. And it is really, really wonderful when you are lucky enough to discover what that motivation is. So I want to introduce you to this family in 1880, Chatham County, North Carolina, in which we have here L.R., his wife Margaret, and their daughter Martha. And we have their ages here, 39, 24, and 5. One particular index their last name as Xlius. And so, once again, it's that having to look for variant names. Their relationship is listed here in the 1880 census, and their occupations, in which I see LR as a register of deeds. So he has a prominent elected position in the county, and his wife Margaret is keeping house, and Martha is at school. We are given in the 1880 census, the first question listed here is the state of birth for the particular individual. So LR was born in West Virginia, and his wife and daughter were both born in North Carolina. The next column and the one following is for the individual's father and for their mother. And all of these breakdowns are in your handout, by the way, of all the key questions that are asked. So here we know that their parents, their individual parents, were born in the states that the particular individual was born in. So this Mr. LR went to North Carolina from West Virginia at some point prior to 1880. But I'm more interested in his wife right now. So she was indexed as Xlius. She's 24 at the time in 1880, and she's married to LR. Going forward, because 1890 census burned, so I had to jump to 1900. They're still in Chatham County, North Carolina. Here I have Maggie Xline, and Maggie is the head of this household. Listed below is her son-in-law, and listed below that is her daughter and her grandsons. We are given in 1900 the month and the state, the month and the year of birth for the particular individuals, as well as their ages. Marital status, as well as 1900 asked how many years had the person been married. Maggie says she's been married 27 years, and her daughter, Martha, says she's been married for 4 years. The next question is, how many children, for women, how many children did you were born and how many were still living? And so we now know Maggie or Margaret only had one child, and that would be Maddie or Martha. So from that particular census, we knew Maggie or Margaret was still married. Don't know if she's still married to the gentleman from 1880, but we know she's married, but her husband was not on that census record with her. She was listed as married for 27 years, but her husband, we could guess, is that gentleman from 1880, but we're not sure as of yet. So we want to make sure before we jump to the conclusion that's the same person. We want to find out what happened to him. Well, her missing husband, because of the fact that he was a register of deeds in the 1880 census, started looking for him and other records, such as newspapers, and discovered he actually kept getting promoted to other positions within government, including he eventually got put up for a position in Washington, D.C. And so discovered him actually in the 1899 official register of the United States for officers and employees of the Civil, Military, and Naval Service, in which I found L.R. Laban R. Xline, born in West Virginia, was appointed from Chatham County, North Carolina, and he was employed in Washington, D.C., and his compensation as of 1899. This explains why Mr. Xline was not on that 1900 census with his wife, because he was actually working in Washington, D.C. So looking for his wife a little bit more, in 1910, once again, same county in North Carolina. Here we find Margaret Xline. She is marked as widowed in the 1910 census. And as you can look, based on her age, we are following the right person. Other details have been matching up. So what happened to her husband? He wasn't in that 1900 census because he was in Washington, D.C., and she was widowed in 1910 because her husband, L.R. Xline, had died in 1909. So 1920, continue following Margaret, Maggie, so forth. Find her same county once again. This time, she actually has her grandson from the previous census living with her, Radcliffe. Though the indexer for this particular census had trouble reading that X there. So they actually put a question mark in the actual indexing of her last name. But following along and looking at information about her, I see that she is a proprietor of a hotel. And so I found her once again in 1920, and looking at those ages, everything's lining up. And when I look for her again, 1930, same county, except she has a different last name now. She's now Maggie Norwood, and her daughter, same last name for her daughter. And here it says, well, Radcliffe is her son, but we know from previous census, because it was repeatedly on the census, that Maggie only had one child, and that was Maddie or Martha. Radcliffe was the name of a grandson, though, who was the son of Maddie. So here's one of those original oops that they made involving Radcliffe. We see here on the 1930 census ages and the fact that Maggie and her daughter Maddie are widowed. And the question next to their marital status is age at first marriage. So based on how they responded to that particular question would start to tell us there's possibility of marriages before previous marriages that we've seen on the census and so forth. So Maggie is listed with a different last name. She's marked as widowed, but we knew she was widowed from Mr. Xline. They have her age at first marriage, which lines up with her age based on how long she had been married previously in the earlier census. So not sure what's happening with this new surname because there is no other person listed on the census with them to give us any hints. Here, Maggie is no longer the actual manager of the boarding house. She's the housekeeper, but her daughter Maddie is the manager of the boarding house. So the family does own this particular property. And Radcliffe, based on the question over here on the 1930 census, when they asked the question of if you had served in the military, yes. And in what military action and what war? And so he answered that he had served in the World War. So here we have that Radcliffe served in the World War, and it's 1930. And this is definitely indicating it's World War I that he served in, because World War II would be the next decade. So here we have that Maggie Norwood is widowed, but we believe we're on the right track. And so we look for her in 1940. We find her same county. Here she is listed as the mother. She's widowed. Everything's matching up. She's born in North Carolina. But when we look, she's mother to the head of household, Roscoe Gordon, which does not make sense because once again, she's had one child this entire time, and that's been Maddie/Martha. And so as we're looking at this, if you look at the person right above her, that person also is indicated as mother to the head of household. And so it starts to raise a red flag. If you'll notice, there is like a little indentation over here on the document, which looks like someone tried to make an arrow and a line going to the family above with another arrow. And there we see Maddie, Martha, and her son, Radcliffe, on the census. So another original oops where when they documented this, somehow Maggie got separated from the family she was living with and entered on the census with the family next door below on the census. And so we have to pay attention that this didn't make sense, so that we could really look at this document and recognize there's a little note there with those arrows directing us to the family above. And just browsing the page, we would have realized, oh, wait, there's that family that we recognize from the other documents right above. So this is why you really want to make sure you're looking at the surrounding neighbors. So 1940, she is using that name Xline again, and she's widowed. So she's had some kind of name change between 1920 and 1930. Not sure if the name change as of yet. And we know by 1940, she's back to using her previous spouse's name of Xline. So what's her motivation? To make sure I hadn't made a mistake here by jumping to a family who looks similar, I started to look at other details in the census, such as the street. So comparing 1920, 1930, here we have, she's living on Hillsborough Street. Here's Maggie. And there's her neighbor, Maggie or Margaret Horn, and her other neighbor, who is listed as C. Walker or as Carlton W. Hanks. So definitely looking at the right woman. So was this an original oops that was done on the census, or was there a change in her name? Because I have a county, which is the beauty of census records, having those counties every 10 years of where we can look for all these records for these people. I went ahead and just started going through. I have a breakdown of the time period. I know it's within a 10-year range. So I look, and lo and behold, there is a marriage record for a J.C. Norwood of Chatham County marrying a Margaret Xline. And so it's listed that they were married in 1921. So that at least tells me definitively she remarried. That's where that Norwood name came from. But she's widowed again. So did she really lose her husband within a 9-year window? Yes, she did. Here we have J.C. Norwood. And once again, because I know the county, I know the time period, I just start going through those death records. J.C. Julius Caesar, or Julius R. Norwood, and he died. And the person who is marked as his wife or his widow is Margaret Xline, and he died in 1927. So now I know that her husband, Mr. Norwood, did die in 1927, and she's using Margaret Xline as the name on his death record, but Xline is not her maiden name. So why does she keep going back to the Xline name? Her daughter's already married. Her daughter is already using her husband's name. So it's not because of her child. So why keep going back to this name? Well, made me curious. So I started going through some newspapers, and lo and behold, let me tell you about the Xline House, a leading hotel on Hillsborough Street in Pittsboro, North Carolina. The Xline House is truly the traveling man's retreat. That clever lady, Mrs. Xline, is the proprietress. The hotel is conveniently situated in the business part of the town. No better house so far as table or room are concerned can be enjoyed by the traveling public anywhere in the state. And the good hostess looks after everything herself. Attached to the hotel is a first-class livery. Mrs. L.R. Xline is building an addition of 5 rooms to her hotel at Pittsboro, was another article. So definitely Mrs. L.R., Mrs. Laban Xline, definitely our lady living on and having the hotel on Hillsborough Street in Pittsboro. Everything perfectly matches up with those census records. And she also had as an occupation the proprietress of a hotel, and the fact that her daughter then took over the business. all of it perfectly matches up with this article. This is why she was motivated to keep going back to that surname, because she had created a business using that surname. So, just to give you an idea of what you can learn and the motivations you can learn just by following the trail in the census and kind of branching out with those, because you got the time periods every 10 years in the county specifically you're looking for, you can start to fit these pieces together to see if they truly connect. So, next up, I want to share with you an immigrant's account. I'd like to introduce you to Mikhail Topol. He is in Chicago, Cook County, Illinois, 1920. He is with his wife, Wanda, and their children. In the 1920 census, one of the questions has to do with year of immigration. The question next to that, they have an A marked, which means that they were naturalized. If they had PA, that meant they filed first papers, which is a declaration of intent. And if they had AL, that meant that they were an alien and they had not filed any papers to become a US citizen as of yet. The next question with the years, 1913, is when they became citizens. Once again, asking those questions about where they were born, we see that Mikhail was born in what is basically the Russian part of Poland, and his wife Wanda was born in the German area of Poland. This is based on them responding in 1920. So even though I don't know the particular area in Poland as of yet, what town, I now have an idea where I can go to a map and start to see the Russian area and the German area of Poland to start narrowing it down. He's a street engineer for a chemical company in Chicago. So we got a lot of great information about him and his wife just from that one record. Based off of that, because he was naturalized, I went ahead and started looking for him. Started looking for his naturalization. So here I have Mikhail Joseph Topolsky. He was born in Russia, according to this document, which matches with that Russian part of Poland. I get the town. His wife is Wanda. She is born in Germany, according to this document. This is a petition that took place in 1914. He states that he applied or filed his declaration originally in 1910. Looking at his declaration, I find Michael Joseph Topolsky, and he is living at this time in 1910 at 10547 Throop Street in Chicago, Cook County, Illinois. So let's look at the 1910 census for that area. And here I find Michael Topolsky, and he is living at Throop Street. So I know I have the correct gentleman, no matter how these names could possibly be changed. So we originally had Topolsky. He's listed here that he is the brother-in-law to the head of the household. When I look at the family breakdown, head of the household is Joe Bozinski with his wife, Stella. I'm getting their ages. And I see here, Michael is from the Polish-speaking region of Poland, which is different than what he had said previously, recall. But because 1910 big difference in years, 10 more years, in which this is a different region if you mapped it out based on what was going on in that area. And if you look above, trying to determine brother-in-law, well, how is he related to Joe? Well, if you look at Joe's wife, Stella, she also matches up. She was also born in the Polish-speaking region of Poland. Her parents, her father was from the German-speaking region of Poland, and her mother was from the Russian-speaking of Poland. That perfectly matches Michael. Oops, sorry. And as we look further over, we once again get that Michael actually arrived in 1902, and according to the 1910 census, he filed his first papers, which perfectly matches the fact that we found his Declaration of Attention in 1910, which were his first papers. 1914, he filed his petition to become a naturalized citizen. So in 1920, he was able to answer that question that yes, he was a US citizen and naturalized in 1920 census. So we have immigration information, information that leads us to naturalization records from a census. So just to give you a highlight of how you could just break down from essentially 2 census records, this gentleman and, well, the steps he took to become a US citizen. And finally, I would like to explain to you about a family connection. This tale is about a family in Kansas. So here we have in Wichita, Sedgwick County, we have Frank Williams, his daughter, we have Frank Williams, his wife Stella, and his mother-in-law, Cayenne, not sure what the name is right there, but we see that she is the mother-in-law to Frank. Here's another of my absolute favorite questions that's asked on a census, 1930. They were interested in knowing what the community, what our country, how it was doing financially. Remember, this is right before the Great Depression. I want to know how everything's going. So economically, can people in this country afford that hot new technology? They wanted to know, did you own a radio? And so this question lets us know whether or not the family could afford and whether they had a radio. Here we have their ages once again. We see that Frank and Stella are married, and Sina, the mother-in-law, is widowed. She's 96 years old here in 1930. We see that Sina was born in Illinois. Her parents were born in Tennessee. We see that Stella was born in Illinois. Her father was born in New York, and her mother was born in Illinois. So starts to lead us to the idea that maybe Sina is Stella's mother. So details we got off of that particular census. So then when we jump to 1900, so we're still in Kansas, but now we're in a different county, Laban County, Kansas. In 1900, here is Stella, who is the daughter of, it's hard to read the handwriting, but it's Chrisanna Craw. We're given the month and the year of birth, their ages, and Chrisanna is widowed. She had 8 children, 6 of whom are living at this time in 1900. Based on the information provided, Stella and her mother were both born in Illinois. Her mother's parents or her grandparents were born in Tennessee, and for Stella, her father and mother, her father was born in New York, her mother born in Illinois. So it's matching what was in the previous census we looked at. And that Chrisanna owns her house, and she owns it outright. So her name was indexed various ways. She was Sina Anna, Oni Anna. There were just numerous documents with numerous spellings to her name for basically what was Sina. So jumping back to 1880, trying to find this family. So all we have right now was Sina and her daughter Stella. So looking for Stella, because I figured that was an easier spelling, found Stella Crawl with her mother, Sini Crawl, in Madison County, Illinois, which starts to match up because the fact that they both were born in Illinois at a point. But here we have all these other children, because remember, Sina had, according to the last census, 8 children, 6 who were living in 1900. And were given their occupations, so they're farmers, basically. And the information's matching up, involving the fact of Sina being born in Illinois, her parents being born in Tennessee, and for all the children, they're all born in Illinois, their father born in New York, and their mother born in Illinois. So based on these details, start to feel like we've got the right family. So based on those details, paying attention to the dates with the children, Ira was the earliest child born on that census. And so Ira was born in Illinois in 1856. And so that starts to give me some ideas, because I know that I'm trying to find what happened with Sina's husband. Stella, her last child, was born in 1872 in Illinois. So I know that the father died some point between 1872, maybe 1871, or after, that he was deceased by 1880 by that census, and that Sina and her husband had to have been married or started their family prior to 1856 with Ira's birth. So continuing to look for the family, 1870 census, because I had that time period I knew was the possibility. Here I find Cynthia Craw, 36 years old. She's keeping house. Relationships were not provided, but here we have a breakdown of children who are of the age, and the person who is the head of household is Orange Craw. And when you look at their places of birth, Sina is born in Illinois. All the children are born in Illinois, and Orange was born in New York, which matches the details we had already seen previously. So how do I know I have the right family? For sure, comparing those two 1870, 1880 census years, here I have, since Ian was 36, Sini A is 46, Ida, 14. Ida is a female in the 1870 census, 14 years old, but in 1880, Ira, a male, 24. Sylvester, spelled slightly different, 12 and 21. Flora, 9 and 19. Herman, or Alba H., 2 and 12 years old. And Minnie, who's 8 months and 10 years old on the 1880 census. So based on this, I know I am on the right family. This is matching up. So continuing to look at that 1870 census, I see once again that the family are farmers, and I see that Orange owns property. Key element for me right here, because That means that when Orange dies somewhere between 1870 and 1880, there is going to be dispersal of this property because somehow his wife ends up in Kansas. Why? Why does she do this? So this is the information I've gotten so far off that census record. Based on the fact of the children's age and the census, I had the narrow window for death date. So it's not a big deal to go through Madison County records for probate because he owned property and discover 1874. Here we have a petition for an executor for his estate because Orange Crawl had died the 10th of April, 1874, leaving no last will and testament. We get a breakdown of the property he owns, as well as a breakdown of his children and their ages at the time of his passing. So now we know when he died, but difference between 1874, 1880, the family is still living in Illinois. It's not like Orange died and the family moved. So 1874, they're living there. 1880, they're living there. But by 1900, Cena had left. So here we have looking at some deed records. Once again, because those census, I have the county and I have a window of time. I discover that in 1891, Cena sold the property. And 9 years later, she's living in Kansas. I still don't understand why she would go to Kansas, though. So looking more in the family, just based off the details that were provided, I had a window of possibility for marriage dates. So I started looking for marriage dates, and here I have December 20th, 1851, Orange Crawl and Cindy Ann Cherry got married. And they got married in McAlpin County, Illinois. So different county in Illinois than where the family settled. But typically, these records and licenses were filed at the county that the wife resided, that the female resided. So that tells me I need to now look in McAlpin County to learn more about Cena. And so when I do and look in 1850, because 1851, she's getting married, and I have that last name off the marriage record, here I find Cinia Cherry, born in Illinois, living with her parents, Peterson and Keziah Cherry, born in Tennessee, which matches those previous census records that told me that her parents were born in Tennessee. So I've now traced this family back 3 generations. But still don't know why she decided to move to Kansas after her husband died. Well, couldn't find the Cherry family in Illinois after a bit, but could find the Cherry family living in Kansas. So once again, using the records, narrowing it down, I discover a will in Laban County, Kansas, which is where Cena wound up for Peterson Cherry, in which his beloved wife, Keziah Cherry, is listed, as are his children, including his daughter, Cena Ann Crawl. So now we have her listed with her married name on her father's will. Definitive proof that the trail I traced with the census records perfectly aligned with the family records. Remember the first or the second census actually that we looked at, the 1900 census, where we had Stella with her mother. Look at the person who's living right next to them, who's listed right below them on the census record. That name should look very familiar. It's Keziah Cherry, the mother of Sina Ann. She is living right next door. I don't need someone to tell me that after losing her husband, that Sina Ann decided that she was going to move to Kansas to be near her family, to be near her mother. For whatever reason, whether it's for her mother or for herself, she chose to do this. And it makes perfect sense. And I have documents now that actually align with this. Based on, once again, the ages matching up, details matching up, those birthplaces, Illinois, parents born in Tennessee, and Keziah Cherry, who's listed here in Kansas, was born in Tennessee as well. So I hope from today you've seen how you can take the details from a census record and are able to discover so much more about your family, that using variant searching, variant spellings, variant dates, broadening, looking outside localities, trying different indexes, using different websites, searching for those other family members, and browsing the census. I know people hate that so much, but look at what you can see if you really are looking at the page fully. And you can learn your family story, and you can learn details about them that you never thought you could learn, as you could see from the examples from today.